You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
I told you, man! I told you! Don't fuck with me!
Representing our 18 grandchildren. I have Linda, who's over here. She's a student at Texas A&M. But it is a real delight to have such a nice reception because what you're really receiving is not me especially, but the cause of liberty, the revolution. And we need to spread it to make sure all Americans join in and decide that we're opting for liberty, less government, less tyranny, less war, less... Unfortunately, we have a major task, especially you, the young people, the university students. It's a bad time to be getting out of college when you think about who has the debt? Maybe some personal debt and maybe some national debt. And where are the jobs? You know, this is not an easy time. But the answers aren't difficult. If you figure out what caused the problem, the answers aren't difficult because I am convinced that we have not had enough freedom in this country, not enough respect for private property, not enough respect for sound money and contracts. Trouble that way, guess what the solution ought to be? Just send people to Washington who have read the Constitution and will read it. It's really all there. It's the gross distortion of the Constitution and this idea that the Constitution is something flexible and you have to adapt to modern times without amending it. That's where the real problem is. But the misuse of the Interstate Commerce Clause, the misuse of the General Welfare Clause, the ignoring of the Monetary Clause, and the ignoring of the Fourth Amendment, the invasion of our privacy, the ignoring of the Declaration of War, these are the things we need to remind the American people and all the politicians that we need to stick to our guns and obey the Constitution, and we will solve our problems. A lot of people claim that'll take a lot of sacrifice and we'll have to really sacrifice and buckle down. You know, I don't even think of it as sacrifice. If we can restore liberty to the people, get rid of the income tax, give you all this money, no bailouts to the rich, no foreign adventurism and bringing our troops home and saving all that. That protects our civil liberties, because that's how you bring people together. Not by dividing us and thinking of us in different groups and what privileges we get and no penalties for groups. If we can just bring people together and say we all should come together because we're individuals, we all should have equal protection under the law. Yeah. That should not be one sacrifice. The people who are worried about it and warned and screamed and hollered 4 or 5 years ago, you need to bail us out, you need to take care of us, we're too big to fail, there's a depression coming. Well, they need a depression. The guys have been living off us, but not the people. And this is what happened when the crisis hit after to the individuals involved in the Fannie Mae's and the Freddie Mac's and the Goldman Sachs, and they needed the bailouts. And the programs, like a housing program, was essentially designed to help poor people. It was well motivated, but the whole idea didn't work. Prompting the government or insisting government make bad loans didn't make a lot of sense. Guess who made a lot of money when the bubble was being blown up? The very wealthy. But they got the bailout. The middle class lost their jobs and they lost their houses. We have to rethink this entitlement system, because when you do the entitlement system with the pretense of helping the poor, tragically, you end up helping the rich and you make more poor in this country. We need to pay a lot of attention to protecting our privacy. Government was established, our government was established mainly to have a republic, to have a small government, to have open government, so that we know what our government's doing, and that people's privacy would be protected. That's why they gave us the Fourth Amendment, because privacy was not protected under the dictatorship of the king. And when this was passed, it seemed like it would work, but in the last several years, especially in the last 10 years, it hasn't been working very well. Because the one bill that has caused more harm, and we do need to repeal it, that is the Patriot Act. For the people, and the role of the government should be to protect the privacy, not the secrecy of the government. And a good place to start to reverse that is expose the Fed for what they're doing and have a full I think that's a great idea. The Fed will end itself because it's non-viable. All fiat currencies self-destruct. The whole problem is if you don't do it in a deliberate fashion and an organized fashion, it can be very bad, because it ends up in runaway inflation and high interest rates. It ends up with economic turmoil as well as political turmoil. That's what we have to try to prevent. And that is the reason my modest suggestion to get us back on track is to get the budget balanced. And that's the reason I want to cut $1 trillion out of the budget in 1 year. And you can do that with having priorities. People say, oh, the government's not going to spend $1 trillion. How many people are going to suffer? Well, some people who are living off the government, they might. Maybe some foreign beneficiaries, maybe people who get foreign aid. What about these wars that we're involved in? We're involved in so many countries. We're in over 150 countries. We have over 900 bases. And now they're putting troops in, and they're planning to stir up trouble in Syria with the intent that we're supposed to go and start a war and fight a war in Iran. We don't need any more wars. We need a war. Easier place to stop the spending, stop all the bailouts, get rid of some of the departments that we don't use. Go back a couple years to my proposal, go back to the budget of 2006. The government wasn't very small then, but we could do that. The reason I advise that is if we have some programs that maybe deserves a little more protection. There are some that even I wouldn't have strongly endorsed, but we have taught the people to be so dependent. Like medical care for the elderly, Social Security benefits. Those programs, they're broke, but the promises were made, and how are they going to be taken care of? Child health care. I believe very sincerely that we can protect those programs if we have the priorities, but we have to change our foreign policy. And that is what we really changing our foreign policy isn't the easiest thing to do in a Republican primary. And, but the tremendous benefit from a program like that is you work on this whole principle of the people you can bring together, the coalitions you can build, the same way on independent liberty you bring individuals together because their liberty is used by themselves, but you can bring people together on foreign policy. There's a lot of good Republicans now. As a matter of fact, George Bush Jr. ran in the year 2000 on a humble foreign policy and no nation building and not to be the policeman of the world. That's a pretty good foreign policy. That's what we're talking about. So we should have Republicans willing to support it. We have a lot of independents support this. We have progressive Democrats that are willing to support this. And when you think of financially the need for this and having a trade-off stops some of the fighting overseas that accomplishes nothing, probably the bad thing it accomplishes, it builds more enemies. But at least we could tide ourselves over and work our way out. If we continue to spend overseas and all the entitlement programs and bail out everybody and not cut anything, nobody else is talking about making cuts. In Washington, the Republican proposal says that, well, we're going to nibble at the proposed increases, and in 30 years we're going to have a balanced budget. That's not being very serious. But if we want to do that, we have to cut, and I believe we can work our way out of it. So it is a problem that if it is not solved, the spending will lead to even bigger debts. Right now, our deficit is running close to $1.5 trillion a year. And the debt is now up to $16 trillion. We're the biggest debtor to foreign nations, the biggest in the history of the world. And which countries are we owing to? Countries that we used to condemn for their communism, like China, that we owe them the money, and they can hold us hostage because of this. But we have lived beyond our means. And if an individual lives beyond his or her means, the only way they get back on their feet again when they run out of credit is they have to cut back, they have to sell something, they have to work harder, and they have to get rid of the debt. It is not different as a nation. Now, liberal economists will argue with me quite frequently that no, a nation is different than an individual. What a nation does when it's broke is it's supposed to spend more money. And the deficit is endless, and they're supposed to print more money. And they've been doing it now for 5 years, and they wonder why the economy's in the doldrums. And really, our economy and our standard of living has been going down since the year 2000 with the collapse of the NASDAQ bubble. And then it got much worse in 2008 when the collapse of the housing bubble. So this has been slipping and sliding for a long time. And you know, there is one statistic that is a mixed statistic, because some people say, hey, this is great, and I think it's an indication of a serious problem. You know, between the year 1995 and the year 2000, there were 2.9 million individuals, people coming from Mexico, illegal and legal. And in the last 5 years, between 2005 and 2010, that went down over 50%. It went from 2.9 down to 1.3. So it was a collapse of the people coming into this country. People say, well, that's great. You know, this is wonderful. But guess what? There were more people leaving than there were coming in. So this sort of puts this whole immigration thing into proper perspective. But you say, well, is it because they're obeying the law, or because we are threatening people? No, you know what I think it is? That we're not as attractive as we used to be. We don't have the economy. Of course, my goal is to have a healthy, thriving economy and have a much more sensible immigration policy where we can invite people to come in and have them come in much easier with work permits and come back and forth and make it best for all of us. But you can't do that with the weak economy. Well, you want to beef up the immigration services to facilitate it and make it more efficient. Yes, well, where are you going to get the money? I would get it from us worrying too much about the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Even in the midst of those years when we have a lot more immigrants, illegals coming in, I had a lot of people come to my congressional office, and they were interested, how do I get some people to come in, because I need jobs, Americans won't take the jobs, and how can we do this? So even in the midst of all this condemnation of immigrants coming in, there was a need. We now, I think it's 600,000 jobs are going begging in this country, and people aren't well enough trained. So we have a problem here. To blame the world and blame Chinese for our problems or blame immigration as our problem, we have to look to ourselves and decide what is wrong. One of the excuses they use for us to be in the Middle East, the neoconservatives say, well, we have an obligation. We are an exceptional nation. We have exceptional values. And there's no Soviet Union, so now we're king of the world. And we have this obligation to spread our goodness around the world, even if we have to use force. I think that makes no sense whatsoever. Wilson's Making the World Safe for Democracy also. It's a reminder of the Jacobins and the French Revolution. You'll do it our way. We want to do all these wonderful good things and create this beautiful democracy. And if you don't do what we tell you, we chop your head off. And there is a better way, because I happen to have strong beliefs that our country is, at least in the past, and we have a good history. We have a history of great constitution. Once we're the wealthiest country in the world. We have the biggest middle class. And we have been exceptional in many ways, and we still have a lot of exceptional values, and I want to spread them. And my suggestion is that we restore that confidence in our freedoms and restore our confidence in our laws and our Constitution, make ourselves a society that people will respect and they will want to emulate us, set a good standard of sound money and property rights. I sometimes use a medical term. I think it's schizophrenic, because how many friendly dictators did we have that we turned around later on we had to fight? Bin Laden was on our side one time, Saddam Hussein was on our one side, Noriega's been on our side one time. It's on and on. How about Mubarak? How many billions of dollars did the American people have to send to the dictator of Egypt? And then, that fell down. We had to help the dissidents, and then we throw him out. And now I think, as far as buying friendship for Israel, I think that's worse than ever. And guess what? The people taking over Egypt right now are infiltrated with Al-Qaeda, as it is in Libya, as it is in Syria. So this is why the founders were correct. There's no authority for us to do it, and the founders were correct. Mind our own business, stay out of the internal affairs of all other nations. Some who would say, oh, people that believe in that, you're a bunch of isolationists. You don't want to deal with the world. You don't want to be involved. But that isn't true, because those very individuals that might throw that term out at us as isolationists are the ones who always want to use sanctions. They want to put sanctions on countries, on Syria, on Iran, and cause trouble, hurt the people. Maybe the people then will overthrow their government. But the whole thing is you put on sanctions, you hurt the people. They know who did it, and they hate they more likely hate Americans, not their own. And then they come together for a sense of nationalism. Those individuals who talk about us being isolationists, they're the ones who after 50 years don't want to talk to Castro and don't want to work with Cuba. I think it's time we talk to the Cubans and trade with Cubans and travel. Talk about a schizophrenic foreign policy. I think the worst example is with Pakistan, because my claim used to be that we have two policies, we have two options. We go to them, and if they buy into what we offer and we prop up their dictator, we give them a lot of money. If they don't do what we want, then we bomb them. So we have an offer, either money or bombs. And of course, I want a little bit of diplomacy, a little bit of friendship. But what we do with Pakistan is we give money to the government of Pakistan, and we constantly bomb the people. I mean, we do both together. And then we wonder why, and that causes a conflict between the people. They hate their government, and then they say, well, there's, it's unstable in Pakistan. Well, it's an unstable society to begin with, but I don't think we're helping out a whole lot by assuming war on the world, war on terrorism, global war on terrorism. And with these drones going around the world, we claim that we can hit any spot and they have the technology to do it. Obama wanted to be so adamant about it and brag about it. He says, we have the authority now. If we have an American citizen and we can't quite capture him, we can just assassinate him with a drone, and that's what they have done. Not only that, he knew another family member of that family, and he was told, well, the family member knows all about it. He's part of the problem. He was born an American citizen also, and he was 16 years old. He was assassinated while he was barbecuing with his cousin. And this is made law of the land under an executive order. Those are the kind of laws a constitutional president would never obey and would repeal them by another. We have drifted a long way from the Constitution and what the founders advised us. Foreign policy is a big, big issue. And 70% of the American people now, guess what? They agree with this position. They say, come home. We've had enough of Afghanistan. I remember so clearly the 60s because I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well as during the Vietnam period. I was in for 5 years. And it was a utter tragedy. 60,000 Americans died, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, came back. And even later on, as a physician and in Congress, I had to deal with and continue to deal with veterans not getting benefits from even wars back as far as Vietnam. And what about the men and women coming back from the injuries now from Iraq and Afghanistan? They're not getting well treated. There's an epidemic of suicide. We're losing more military personnel from suicide now from the battlefield. The best thing to do is they use the term stop the bleeding, stop the wars, and then concentrate. This is one area that we do have a moral obligation and a constitutional authority to take care of those individuals we sent over erroneously and badly. But I went because I believe, like so many of us, it is our duty to try to do our very best. But really, the responsibility falls on those individuals in the government. And I've told my veterans back at home that, yes, I was drafted, I went and did my very best, but I've learned to disapprove of our foreign policy. But now, having been in Washington, I voted in the Congress on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I have a different obligation to stand up and tell people. So this is what I did as early as 1998. They were changing the law. They changed the law and said the law now is to overthrow Saddam Hussein. That was the first speech I gave in 1998. Invading Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Right. The Al-Qaeda was there and they had weapons of mass destruction. And here's an individual that we were allies with. Iraq got their first nuclear reactor years before with our help. But and then we wonder about why we're doing so poorly with relationship with the Iranians. Well, of course, in 1953, what did we do? We overthrew an elected leader, Mossadegh. And Americans seem to have no memory, but the Arab and Muslims seem to never forget. And they remember, and that is what prompted the 1978 overthrow of the Shah. So, but what else did we do later on to sort of antagonize and stir up this problem over there is that we instigated and supported Saddam Hussein, you know, invasion of and fighting for about 8 or 9 years against the Iranians. The Iranians know this. So it just makes no sense. It is coming to an end. Even when I talk to audience and that I know they disagree with me, no, we're defending America, we're defending our Constitution, we're defending our freedoms. And I say, well, you can argue that. I said, but I'll tell you what, we're going to win the argument. Our side will win the argument. We are winning that argument because the majority's coming with us, but you really win the argument, unfortunately, when you bankrupt the country, and that's what we're facing today. You know, bin Laden, it wasn't an accident that he promoted. He actually wrote and said what he was doing and why he was doing it. And he had three things that, he had several things he wanted to do. One he wanted to do with attacking us was to draw us into some country in the Middle East and get bogged down in a war. To his surprise, we did more than one country. We really got bogged down. The other thing that he wanted to do was to cause dissent in this country over war. He was probably thinking about the dissent of the 1960s. And he also wanted to contribute to the financial crisis in this country. And it just seems like we're blinded to that, because all of a sudden if you say anything like this, oh, you're un-American, you don't support the troops, you don't care about them. Well, I'm pleased to say that we get more money from the troops than all the other ones put together. Nancy Reagan had a saying, and when she talked about drugs, she said, just say no. But I want to just say no to more than one war. Just say no to these undeclared wars that we're involved in now. Just think we wouldn't have had a war since World War II if we'd have only gone to war under constitutional grounds. And we should never go to war without getting authority from the United Nations. Time to say no to the federal war on drugs. I don't believe it. The borders are not safe, and it isn't immigrants coming in to try to survive that's causing the problem. It's the war on drugs that's causing the problem. The president just recently was down in Colombia and the various nations of Central America, including Mexico. They suggested to the president, let's have a discussion about maybe considering changing some of these drug laws. He wouldn't have any part of it. They wanted to talk about having a more open relationship with Cuba. He didn't want to talk about it. But the war on drugs has been very devastating to our civil liberties. It's been very costly. Since the 1970s, it's cost over $3 trillion. Just say it's debt. We had to borrow the money from some foreign country to fight this. Drugs are more readily available than ever before. And the whole thing is, as bad as some of these illegal drugs are for people, and as serious as that problem is, the real serious problem in this country today with drug addiction are prescription drugs. Issue, to me, it's a freedom issue. Freedom to make your own choices, even when you make dangerous choices that you get to make. We all assume in this country that we can make the very serious decision about our spiritual life and our hereafter. That's pretty serious, and we don't want the government dictating on that. We don't want to tell the government dictating to us what our intellectual pursuits would be and what books we can read. But we all of a sudden just accept the notion that even though there can be risk in those religious beliefs and intellectual beliefs, which causes, revolutions and different things, we as a people have accepted the notion that the government and some agency, all the way from the federal government, now including the United Nations, down to your local government, telling you how much salt you can put on your food and what you can eat and drink, and prevent you from, alternative health care. So that war needs to end. Another reason why the war doesn't end, erroneously, some people with religious beliefs, and I don't fault them for saying, drugs are bad, we'd like to teach our children, but that's up to us, the individual, our children, our parents. In this, I suspect that the laws will eventually come to our senses, because when you see individuals who were strongly in support of these laws changing their mind, and there are some religious leaders like Pat Robertson now said, maybe these laws aren't working, maybe we ought to reassess them. We are making progress, and Steve Forbes, a good friend of mine in the financial market, the laws aren't working, prohibition doesn't work, we tried it with alcohol, didn't work, causes criminality. We put people into prison for life for 3 offenses, non-violent, and yet we hear of murderers and rapists getting out after 5 or 10 years. To bring people together, because when you use the term states' rights, sometimes it gets a bad rap. They say, oh, that means you're not a good person, and states' rights is a code word for bad things. But the whole thing is the Constitution allows for states to deal with a lot of problems. That's who's supposed to take care of it. But so the left generally will criticize the right for saying states' rights, but here, what about the left tends to be more sympathetic for making personal choices. So if you have a state like California, where it's only legalization of individuals who are sick and in wheelchairs and have multiple sclerosis to use marijuana that they raise in their backyard, and we're sending the feds in there to overrule the state laws. If any time, that is where we should say state law should override. And of course, it's been a disappointment to me and to some others, because our president had given us some hope that he would be more modest in the way these laws are being enforced. But to literally arrest people, and it's been done, who are in wheelchairs and never committed a violent act, we need to just wake up and say, it's time. The drug war has been the excuse for a lot of people's homes to be busted into. And it's not like 1 or 2 a month or 1 or 2 a week. I mean, I think it's into the hundreds per day when you have these operations, local and federal and FBI, breaking in and say, oh, we heard, there were drugs in here, and breaking in and killing people that were totally innocent. And breaking up property and doing damage, and then the people don't even have recourse. This is every bit as bad as what the king was doing with the troops that caused our revolution. That's why we need a revolution. About is a non-violent revolution. Which is well along its way. That's where the great progress has been made in the revolution, intellectually. It's been going on for quite a few decades, so the groundwork has been laid. This particular campaign has, touched into and tapped into it, but we didn't invent it. You have to have an intellectual revolution which preceded maybe for 100 years before our first revolution, because the founders were well versed in the concept of property rights and personal liberties, and they knew the history. But that groundwork has been laid. But I'll tell you what, in the last couple of years, there's something very special going on. I never dreamed that we would get to the point where the Federal Reserve would become an issue in the presidential campaign. I think we should be very pleased with that. I think it's really in the early stages, but I don't think it's going to stop. Because what's happened in 08 and 09 was the obvious need. You know, the foreign policy failed, the entitlement system failed, the monetary policy failed, the debt is uncontrollable, and especially the young people saying, wow, what are we getting into here? And they're waking up and saying, is there a better way? And there is a better way. And I didn't even invent it. Exceptional values that we had that made our country great at one time and the most prosperous. You know, it means the rule of law, protecting individuals equally. It has to do with property rights and so many. All those things have been available and they were developed for many hundred years. These principles have been around, but we're casually throwing them away. And this is what is so disturbing, that by executive orders, the president wrote an executive order just recently, and it was to renew the Defense Production Act. That's a bill, a law that was passed in the 1950s. It's a terrible law. And it said that in the time of a war, an emergency, the president declared a national emergency and take over everything. Everything, financial and all businesses, whatever he sees necessary. That's on the books. He renewed that by the executive order, but he changed it a bit. But he said, in times of peace too. That when I want to make sure that this revolution is successful and we repeal that law for sure. Court ruled a couple of weeks ago and said that any law enforcement officer has the authority under the Constitution now. It was a narrow victory, 5-4. It's a shame that one person can change our Constitution so casually. But it said that anybody who is being investigated or was stopped by a police officer, they could be strip searched. And it would be and I think what we're putting up with at the airports is horrible. We need to get rid of the TSA. All revolutions need a little bit more than just the idea, but we do need the ideas and we do need reasons, but we also have to have passion. We have to really believe in it, and I think this is what is being generated. There's now a lot of passion. I do not know how the election will come out. Right now, it looks like our success is going to be difficult in terms of getting enough of the delegates. But let me tell you, what's going on now will not be stopped. I mean, has come, and it's not going backwards, it's going back and picking up the pieces and move on and refine it, make it a better gold standard, have a better definition. We had a lot of shortcomings over the years. We started off with slavery in this country. So there's a lot of things that we can do much better. And the one important thing is I'd like to get people out of this idea that we are important because we belong to a particular group. The group that we belong to is humankind, and that we are individuals. So if we do that, we give no special privileges to anybody, but we don't give any punishments to a group because they belong to a group. And this is what is so miraculous about the concept of liberty, and we have not had a good exposure to this for 100 years or so. The founders understood it completely. Jefferson knew it when he talked about right to life or right to liberty, right to pursue your happiness as an individual. But now that we have advanced through this slavery stage and all this, I think this can be stated so much better. But we got to put this back together again and say liberty is important. Liberty brings us together, and that each and every one of us may well use our liberty differently. Yeah. But that should bring us together, though. well, if you do that and you have free markets and somebody's poorer than the other person, that means you endorse poverty and that sort of thing. Somebody else will say, well, if you have too much liberty, you might abuse that liberty and do some harm to yourself. Governments can't protect you from yourself, no matter what they try. All they can do is take away your liberties. When you have liberty, you don't make an endorsement. I don't endorse the way people, I happen to be a believer, but I believe in freedom of choice. I believe in free will. And if somebody makes a different choice, if they make it and they hurt themselves, the big thing is, if you do it, if you want your freedoms and you do make bad choices, you have no right to go to your neighbor and demand that you be taken care of. In a good revolution, and it's well motivated, you really strive for what seems to be the impossible. And some people would say, yeah, Ron, that sounds great, but think of the burden, the debt, and all these problems you described. That's too impossible. We can't achieve that. But I think we should always strive. Matter of fact, you won't reach it if you don't strive for it. You don't know exactly. But if you start off in the middle and say, well, we only wanted a half a package, believe me, you'll get about 10%. So you want to strive for the very best. And then the whole thing is the results will surprise us all. And I am convinced that this is what can happen. You can start off. I did not believe, well, matter of fact, first time I ran for Congress, I figured, I had a speech that was pretty similar to this. And I figured, nobody's going to elect me. I'm not going to come out and say, this is what I'm going to give you, this is what I'm going to give you. I want to just give people their freedom, expectations, so we've gotten further along. I believe that if we could restore maximum amount of freedom, I personally would be willing to have less wealth in the country. But I would if I had my freedom, because I value it so much. We don't have to make that choice. If you strive for freedom, you will have prosperity. If you strive for material wealth and ignore freedom, you won't have freedom or your wealth. And this is what we have done. In many ways, the great prosperity that we created has also become a great danger to us. Because over the last 100 years, that great wealth has prompted people to see the redistribution of wealth as an easier road to gaining wealth than it is by just working hard and producing it. So what did it do? It pretended it was help the poor, but guess who got control of the system? The high-paid lobbyists, the people who got the benefits, the military-industrial complex, the subsidies going to farmers, on and on. Everybody's out there with their hands out. And we were so wealthy, and it seemed to work. There seemed to be Republicans and Democrats, conservative and liberals would compromise, like, will you give me this? I'll give you this. But the Treasury's bare now, so it's quite a bit different. And so it worked for a while because we forgot about the basic principles. If we concentrate on the basic principles of individual liberty, realizing that our liberties come from our Creator and not from our government, we can't. Revolution wrote that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the results. So it is going to be hard. But when you have a tough job and you do it and you come back and you're tired but you were pleased with the achievement, you feel really good. I think basic human happiness comes not from getting stuff from anybody or not tricking anybody or having a lot of luck or winning the lottery. Sometimes people win the lottery and they don't end up happy. Some very wealthy people make billions of dollars, they're not really happy. I think the thing that makes people happy the most is feeling like they produced something, that they have been productive, that they've done something, and such a way that the results can be equally benefiting. Somebody might be able to invent the internet and, you know, and all kinds of very complicated things. Others might be more simple in what they do. But I think the rewards are equal, even though the creativity is the difference. A free society for me offers a chance for all of us to strive for virtue and excellence. That is where true happiness comes. Strive for it. But if we depend on the government, and the government's going to take us care of us from cradle to grave and redistribute wealth, solve all our problems, protect us from ourselves, take care of the world, and tell everybody how to live, believe me, it's done only with a return to authoritarianism. They say we want to go back to the old days, the old ages, this idea of free markets. Guess what? Those who argue against these views are the ones who want to go back to the dark ages of tyranny, which I appreciate. This wonderful experiment, the best experiment in the history of mankind. We had the maximum amount of wealth, the largest middle class, and it's slipping away, except it's being revived. And the big test is, can we keep this going, regardless of the immediate election that's coming up? Or are we going to look to our next generation? It used to be easy to say, oh, we got to deal with this because we're passing this debt off to the next generation. It's more imperative that we work more quickly because we are the next generation. We are the ones now who are suffering the consequences and being involved with this debt. This debt crisis around the world is a worldwide phenomenon never known in human history. And just as it brings down countries like Spain and Italy and all the countries that are having trouble, and Greece, our finances aren't really. Some people argue they could be a little bit worse. So we will face that. But this is why we have to move as quickly as possible. And we don't have to wait and say, well, we only have this percentage or this percentage that know and understand it. But there's about 7% who understood our American Revolution. So you're among a special group. The special group that Samuel Adams called that irate, tireless minority willing to go out and start brush fires in the minds and the hearts of men. From my viewpoint, there's a lot of brush fires going on, and they're spreading much bigger than I ever dreamed, and the results are unknown. Each and every one of us have a responsibility, and some people ask, well, what is it? Tell me what to do. But you have to do what you can do and what you know how to do, and whether you can support in a campaign and volunteer, but check it out. You have to be educated to know what this whole philosophy is about, what freedom is about, what our history shows, and why freedom can bring us all together. We should always have diverse crowds when they come together to talk about freedom, because we all want it equally. But we have to know how to defend the gold standard. We have to know how to defend the reason why we don't need a central bank. We have to defend property rights. There's nothing wicked about property. Rich people, if they earn that living honestly, and separate that from the rich people who did it by ripping us off and using the government. So there's always a job. If an individual studies and learns and becomes knowledgeable, there will be a job for you, and it'll come knocking at your door. And it may be in politics, it may be in education, it may be in the media, who knows what. But make yourself available, but understand the issues. We can win this. I'm excited about what's happening. I'm excited that you came tonight. Thank you very much.